Welcome to Card Table Commentary. It's where we try to explain the old and the new economics. I'm your host, Seymour Peterson. In the fifth installment, we showed how debt was being used to enhance economic performance in the 80s. This is what economists would call fiscal policy, but in a way, this is a misnomer because these drawdowns of debt weren't really planned. They were a result of revenues falling short of forecasts or expenses being greater. It can be either because of poor optimistic forecasting. After all, the 80s were where they originated the term the rosy scenario. Or it could just be economic conditions, things that happened that made this happen. Whatever it was, these episodes of borrowing money every year pretty much occurred all the way through the 80s and into the middle of the 90s. We're now going to introduce a new graph showing the amount of economic growth that might be attributed to additional government borrowings. Any good Keynesian economist will tell you that when the government spends money and in excess of any taxes that they collect, that the stimulative effect should produce at least the same amount of additional GDP as the debt incurred. And in fact, many Keynesians would tell you that it'll produce even more, that there would be a multiplier effect. For our purposes, we're going to assume that it was a dollar for dollar enhancement of the growth that there would have been without it. The graph is in terms of percent of GDP, and that gives you a better feel for the 80s borrowing because the amount of additional borrowings of 1.6 trillion during that decade would actually be 4 trillion in 2021 dollars. Back then, the question might have been asked, how much additional debt can we incur without incurring serious consequences? This is the era of the bond market vigilantes. These were purportedly a group of bond traders that if they sensed that the Federal Reserve was getting too inflationary, that they would sell longer-term government bonds and drive up interest rates. And this would serve as a warning to the Federal Reserve that they weren't behaving themselves. But fortunately, before we ever really had to answer that question, starting in 1996, a period of very favorable economic growth and everything just seemed to click. For a 5-year period, the government was actually able to pay down the debt held by the public by fairly small amounts, but that compared to what had been taken down in the 80s and the early 90s, it was a huge turnaround. Everybody wanted to take credit for this, but the real causes of it are probably in 1989, the USSR disbanded. The Soviet Union sort of gave up, and they called it the end of the Cold War. I don't know if it really ended, but it definitely changed. And we were able to relax our defense posture and make considerable cuts in the defense budget. So government spending went down for the first time for a long time, and it gave a lot more options for the government. And the 90s are also the era of the internet and all things internet. New companies were springing up by the day, and it created a lot of jobs and a lot of economic activity. And the third thing that was very favorable in the 90s is it was a time of falling interest rates and a runaway stock market, best stock market that had ever been seen up to that point. Basically, everything was going good in the 90s. And the president and Congress and the Federal Reserve were all being congratulated on the fine job they were doing. Investors were so pleased with how things were going that they began to call Greenspan, the Fed Chairman, the Maestro, for his ability to just perfectly orchestrate changes in the money supply and interest rates to keep this stock market rally going that lasted for a full 10 years. To show you how ridiculous it actually got, CNBC used to station a camera across the street from the building where Greenspan would go for the monthly meetings. And he would get out of a limousine or something and then walk into that building, and they would speculate by how much his briefcase seemed to weigh on what he was going to propose today. It was that much of a celebrity. And basically, all these people were claiming credit for something that probably they had absolutely nothing to do with. President Clinton made it a point to invite Greenspan to sit by him when he delivered the State of the Union address one of those years. Basically, everybody wanted to take credit for the fine economy that was occurring then, all the jobs being created. And as far as I'm concerned, none of them really had much to do with it at all. In the next installment, we'll talk about what I believe Greenspan's real contribution to the 90s was. And we'll set the stage for the terrible 2000s, the decade that followed the 90s.